I'm Eileen Garcia. I'm the City of Oakland's Online Engagement Manager, and I'm here with Darlene Flynn, our Director of Race and Equity. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about life here in Oakland, but before, after, and maybe some things that you see forthcoming. So, I don't know, how would you say that some of your friends and family would describe you?
They would describe me as outgoing, an extrovert. Yeah. Yeah, and it's someone that's passionate about the work that I do, and has a real attention span for it, and some longevity and resiliency around looking at hard issues of race and racism.
Where did you grow up?
Seattle, Washington.
Okay. And can you talk a little bit about maybe, was there any sort of moments or anything that happened to you or inspired you to sort of come into the work that you're doing now?
Well, I think that it's possible that my racial identity has something to do with it. And growing up in Seattle, Washington, which was a fairly progressive part of the country, but actually has all the same challenges with racial inequity that the rest of the country does. So it has one persona and another outcome. And I grew up there in a mixed race family. My mother was white, my father was African American. So although we were a mixed family, I grew up in a time where the city was strongly segregated and where everybody who was a person of color lived in one neighborhood of the city. And because we were a mixed family, my father was black, that was the neighborhood I grew up in, very much immersed in the black community and close to my black family. And yet in a city that was 70% white, generally much more well off than the community that I grew up in. And yet saw itself as being progressive and above the need for a racial conversation.
You worked in labor previously. You did some work in the labor community. You did some advocacy work and activism.
Yes.
And then you decided to come into government, which I think for those of us that have worked in advocacy before is quite a switch.
Well, yes, it is. It doesn't happen that often, but it happens more often than you might think. I think in my particular case, my advocacy work that I did in the community was really more community advocacy, neighborhood advocacy, and school, work around equity in schools. So my labor stuff came later when I actually was a public employee and became the president of my labor union in the city, in the government union that I was a member of in Seattle. So there is labor work in there, but it actually came later. My original work was more local government, activism, and particularly around land use and planning issues. And that caused me to be offered a job working for a council member that was the chair of the land use committee. And so he got to know me through my community work. So that was my activism there. And he also had a strong interest in education, which pushed me more in that direction because I staffed his education issues as well. So it was a great fit because I had been interested in how government impacts land use and communities and neighborhoods when I was on the outside. And then I got to be on the inside working with the policymaker who was working on those issues. Yeah.
And then fast forward to now you're in Oakland. So what do you think you're bringing from that life to Oakland?
Well, following that beginning of my world in public service, I eventually ended up joining the Office for Civil Rights in the city of Seattle and helping to start their race and equity initiative about 12 years ago, 13 years ago now. And they didn't have one. No city in the country had one. And so I got to be part of the originating team that began to structure what this work was going to look like for the city of Seattle. And I think that there's in between there was a lot of time that I worked in policy in different departments after I worked for the council member and got to understand how government and race and racism and racial inequity how they worked together, how they worked not necessarily in a way that creates greater equity for communities that have for hundreds of years been marginalized. So the deeper I got into doing public policy work, the more I came to understand what public policy work had to do with race and equity. And so I got to bring that lifetime of experience and that overview of policy work for 15 years or so by then into that realm of thinking explicitly about how does policy impact people's lives in marginalized communities and what can we do about it.
And what do you think you're most excited about that's happening in Oakland now, and what do you think is probably most challenging?
I'm most excited about. There is so much happening in Oakland. It's really hard to choose one thing. This is very much a movement city. It's an activist city, and I think that that's exciting and has a lot of opportunity in it for making a difference and challenging the structures here that are not dissimilar from the structures that I had encountered in Seattle. But I think Oakland's history around civil rights and being a leader on the West Coast, it doesn't surprise me that now Seattle was the first city in the country to have a race and equity initiative, but now Oakland is the first city in California. So it's a huge opportunity, once again, for Oakland to lead in this really important way. Yeah. I think the challenge that we encounter is that government in general, not specifically Oakland government, but government in general has not actually been particularly aligned with or responsive to the profound level of activism that we experience here in Oakland. So there's a disconnect between what the community can bring us, the richness of perspective and ideas and determination and sheer grit here in Oakland, I think. Yeah. It's a very spirited city. There's a disconnect between that, what the community has, which is incredibly valuable, and what the government has, which is government power and a lot of government decision making. Mm-hmm. So the challenge is to, from the approach that we're using, to change government, to reorient government enough to be able to see the opportunity to create equity by working with community differently, by examining our own policies, practices, and procedures, and how they perpetuate or reinscribe racial disparity, and changing them. So it's a more proactive stance, but it's a proactive stance that will move us toward community and into closer alignment with what the community is asking us for. So that's incredibly exciting, also incredibly challenging, because we're talking about steering city government around enough that those connections can be made. And that doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen easily. Change isn't easy even on the personal level. So when you think about change at the institutional level, you know that it's going to take a fair amount of practice and learning new skills and knowledge that we don't currently have, that we need to take in, new ways of doing things that make it easier for the city to get better outcomes. And that's a process. So we need a strategy, and that's what I brought, because that's what I've been doing for a decade or more, is developing the strategies that can be used in cities to make a difference. And
we're notorious, governments are notorious for not having enough resources, neither communities, right? Mm-hmm. Public service agencies, advocates, we're always looking for more resources. There's never enough money. So if you had unlimited resources, what would you do?
Probably really, I would just replicate the activity in my office a little bit more. I would add a little bit of staff. I would add some more staff. I don't think that ultimately that's not the destination, is to have a big staff of people leading racial equity work, but I think we could move faster if there was more of our capacity to spread around the city. So there's just two of us in the department, and so we just run from one thing to the next as fast as we can. And I know we're making a difference. I can tell we're making a difference, but I also see the big gaps in places that we haven't been able to touch yet, or infrastructure and capacity building work that we haven't done yet, because there's only two of us. So I really do think the first thing I'd do would be have just a little bit more capacity in the department to work with the other departments to build their capacity, at which point we would have more synergy and things would begin to move faster. We'll get there anyway, it will just take a little longer, and faster would be better, because this work it's life-saving work. It is life and safety work. We always talk about that in the city, like that's our highest priority. But racism actually kills. And it doesn't kill necessarily the way we think of it, necessarily quickly, fast, at the wrong end of a gun or something like that. It actually also has a devastating effect on people's life expectancy, on the quality of life, and their ability to contribute to society slowly, like a slow, oftentimes people refer to it as the 1,000 cuts, 1,000 little cuts, of racial disparity. And so this work, however big or small we can do it, is actually about saving people's lives and changing people's lives.
So you've talked about a long range of success and work, and then there's also the success that you're starting to feel now. So what are you seeing now that you know that you're making a difference, and what are the signs of things to come in the future?
Well, I think that what has been hopeful for me since the moment I got here is the willingness of people in city government to take this on, to do this work, to learn, to try new skills, new tools, to think differently, to be willing to have their assumptions shaken up so that we can think about it differently. incredibly welcoming. People are so ready for it, which is why I think being able to reach more people faster would make a difference, because people are asking for this support. They would like to be more successful. People who work in the city of Oakland really want to perform equitably, and they want government to do the best it can do to help people in their lives. And so there's a great deal of willingness, and that makes me very hopeful, because I'm not having to knock down doors to do this work. My problem is running from one door to the other as quickly as I can, because people are really ready, and that's exciting.
Thanks, Darlene. It was great having you, and we look forward to seeing what you do next.